Last episode, we talked about refugees, the global refugee crisis, and the complexities involved in defining who exactly is and is not a refugee. But before someone even becomes a refugee, a state must first acknowledge them as one, and this is achieved through the process of applying for asylum. And it turns out, this process reveals a very real tension between asylum seekers and states, since most states, to the best of their legal ability, want to limit the number of asylum applications they receive. Since the fewer asylum claims made to a country, the fewer people a country ultimately may need to take in. So, what's the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker? Where do people go while they make their claim? And what happens to those individuals when it's in a state's best interest to not process their request? Today's case study will focus on the country of Hungary, its asylum application process, and why some NGOs are beginning to leave the country. This is Motion, a podcast about migration in the 21st century. Asylum is a form of international protection granted by a state to a person who is deemed unsafe in their home country. When you apply for asylum, you're essentially asking to be recognised as a refugee, and with that, all of the protections and rights afforded to one. All refugees at some point are asylum seekers, but not all asylum seekers become refugees. So when we talk about refugees, more often than not, we're actually talking about asylum seekers. That is to say, the people beyond the border who have not yet crossed, rather than the people already inside. In the EU, the process of applying for asylum is made a bit more complicated by something called the Dublin Regulation. The Dublin Regulation entered into force in 2013. The goal, the European Commission said, was to create sound procedures for the protection of asylum applicants and to protect the system's efficiency in processing applications. The Dublin Regulation requires that asylum seekers make their asylum claim in the first EU country they arrive in, and that country alone is then responsible for processing their application and taking in those with legitimate claims to asylum. The goal is to avoid people seeking asylum in the country of their choice, so-called asylum shoppers. But the regulation isn't without its faults. The last several years have seen a huge increase in the number of individuals hoping to claim asylum in the EU.
The number of refugees worldwide hit a record high, a UNHCR report revealed on June 19.
But since asylum seekers must make their claim in the first EU country they enter, countries on the border of the EU, like Italy, Greece, and Hungary, now face huge numbers of asylum applications that they alone must process.
Helicopters, mounted police, and dogs. Hungary is scrambling to deal with the record number of migrants arriving at its southern border.
And this leaves these bordering EU countries in a difficult situation. International law dictates that every individual has a right to ask a state for asylum, and the Dublin Regulation means that neighbouring EU countries are solely responsible for both processing applications and taking in those with legitimate claims to asylum. So, what is a country to do when it suddenly has to process 30,000 claims? By 2015, the Hungarian-Serbian border became one of 3 major entry points for asylum seekers into the EU, with 30,000 claims being made to Hungary in 2016 alone. And this has placed a troubling amount of pressure on the Hungarian government. But the solution they have used to deal with this influx is equally troubling.
So we are the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, a classic human rights watchdog organization.
That's Aniko. I had the opportunity to sit down with her during my time in Hungary to find out more about the country's asylum procedure.
We have a refugee program where we provide legal assistance and legal representation to asylum seekers and refugees in Hungary.
The Hungarian Helsinki Committee was founded in 1989. Today, ANICO, along with the Hungarian Helsinki staff, do human rights monitoring, research activity, and offer legal counselling to asylum seekers in Hungary. Before you can apply for asylum, you must first wait to enter the Hungarian transit zone.
At the moment in Hungary, you can only ask for asylum at the Serbian-Hungarian border. There are 2 transit zones created by the government.
Between March and December of 2016, migrants began to gather in so-called pre-transit areas. Here, people would wait in the hope of entering the Hungarian transit zone to access the asylum procedure in a lawful manner. But the wait could be arduous.
Since January 23rd this year, the asylum authority lets in 1 person per day into the transit zone. There are 2 transit zones, so which means there are about 10 people a week who can enter the asylum procedure in Hungary.
This means that the Hungarian authority essentially processes around 50 claims per week.
These are the only places where asylum can be sought in Hungary. These are places of detention. This is a series of metal containers. This is basically like a high security prison based on what asylum seekers tell us.
And the conditions in these camps aren't great.
So people mostly complain about, as in most places of detention, about the fact that they are being detained and their freedom of movement is very much limited. These people come, they flee wars in Syria, terror, Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran. So I think detention on top of this is further traumatizing for most people. So I think mostly they find this part the most harmful.
The actual procedure may take as long as a few months, meaning asylum seekers have to simply bide their time in the camps. What this sounds like is that the Hungarian government's plan to deal with the influx of asylum seekers is to simply wait these people out. The idea is that given enough time, and if the conditions are bad enough, those waiting to apply for asylum would eventually give up and go back home. Maybe I'm just being cynical here, but I wanted to find out more. So I went to Parliament.
So I'm trying to record a podcast and I'm looking to get your party's view on the European refugee crisis. Would that be okay?
Yes, okay.
Szalai Szabó works for the Jobbik Party in Hungary. Jobbik, the movement for a better Hungary, describes itself as a principled, conservative, and radically patriotic Christian party, whose fundamental purpose is the protection of Hungarian values and interests. At the time of recording, Hungary is governed by a different party, the Fidesz Party, also a conservative right-wing party. I wanted to get a better idea of where the government sits on the issue of asylum claims in Hungary. Szalai was adamant that the Hungarian government had to prioritize Hungarian interests first, before those arriving from other countries.
As the Hungarian state, I think that our first responsibility is to help our citizens because they belong to this country. And up until we are not able to help our citizens, it would be really hard to say that we wouldn't like to help you, Hungarian guys, but we would like to help someone else. I think it would make no sense for us.
When I asked him about the small numbers of asylum claims being processed in Hungary, he explained that part of the problem is inadequate documentation.
Many of these people come without documents, without proper identity cards or passports. And if I, as a Hungarian citizen, would like to come to my country from abroad, I have to show my ID card, I have to show my identity. And many of these people are defying the Hungarian authorities. And I think it is not fair to say that even if you are seeking a better country for yourself, to show a fake identity or not to show your identity at all.
But wait a minute. Back when I was talking to Aniko, the woman from the Hungarian-Helsinki Committee, she explained to me,
most asylum seekers have no documentation, and they are not obliged to have documentation, because when you have to flee, this is not an ideal situation, so you are far from being able to collect evidence for the reasons why you have to flee.
So, according to Aniko, an asylum seeker is not obliged to present documentation because they may not have any documentation. Zele was quick to backtrack when I asked him.
And how they check these documentations, I think it is not a political type of question, it is more a technical question, and I'm not an officer on the Hungarian border. Therefore, I don't have all the information that is necessary for this.
What I garnered from my interview was that maybe I was on the right track with my original impression of the government, but also that I was maybe looking at the Hungarian situation too cynically. The Hungarian government, with what resources it has, wants to look after its people first. That I think I can understand. But what I still struggle with, I think, is the idea that in order to protect its people, the Hungarian government has decided to slow down its asylum procedure to a point that essentially forces applicants to turn back, potentially placing these individuals in further danger should they be forced to return to the country they initially fled from. I want to take a bit of a tangent here away from the asylum procedure and talk a bit more about the current political sphere in Hungary. In May of 2018, the organisation Open Society Foundations announced that it planned to close its international operation headquarters in Budapest due to what they said was an increasingly oppressive political and legal environment. I wanted to find out more about this.
So basically, Open Society Foundations globally was founded in the beginning of the 90s, but our founder, George Soros, our founder's presence, George Soros' presence in Hungary, has a longer history.
Csaba works for OSF, an organisation started by George Soros, one of the world's foremost philanthropists.
We support Hungarian NGOs who are dealing with asylum seekers and assisting them to, let's say, legally submit what they inform and advise them.
I asked Csaba why OSF made the seemingly abrupt decision to leave Hungary. He explained that the government was beginning to crack down on NGOs who were providing aid to asylum seekers at the Serbian-Hungarian border.
Because they are targeting now local NGOs like Amnesty International, Helsinki Committee, and few other small NGO groups or volunteers.
The Hungarian government, Csaba explained, was achieving this through something called the Stop Soros Bill. The law, drafted by Prime Minister Viktor Orban, creates a new category of crime entitled Promoting and Supporting Illegal Migration. What the bill does is essentially ban individuals and organisations from providing any kind of assistance to undocumented immigrants. Now, let's be clear here. The process of applying for asylum is a completely legal process, and asylum seekers are not illegal migrants.
A state's duty is to decide whether those asylum seekers are eligible for those status or not. This is a legal procedure, which is the obligation of every state to conduct this procedure.
But the bill has still got NGOs worried. According to the Hungarian-Helsinki Committee, the primary aim of the legislation was to intimidate, by means of criminal law, those who fully legitimately assist asylum seekers or foreigners. Csaba explained to me that this bill essentially cut off a lifeline to those wanting to seek asylum in Hungary.
But in case of the Hungarian authorities procedure, many times happens that the asylum seekers get papers and decisions and verdicts in Hungarian only, without any translations. So this is why the NGOs' help and support is needed.
Because of the Stop Straw spill, OSF made the difficult decision to move its head office to Berlin. This move will ultimately allow the OSF to continue funding organisations that remain in Hungary that provide services like legal assistance to asylum seekers. But what I think this piece of legislation makes clear is that asylum seekers are not the first, second, or third priority of the Hungarian government. That to drive away migrants, the Hungarian government is willing to criminalise the legal work of NGOs and charities.
Practically, they convince people that they must fear the huge flow of migrants, and those migrants will take and destroy their culture, their religion, and their jobs and everything.
Jaba finished our interview on a very interesting and somber note.
So I feel myself in a dystopia, living in a dystopia, because it's not simply about migration, it's about democracy and freedom.
Next time on Motion, integration. You can find a full transcript of this podcast, along with a bibliography and links to reference articles on Motion's website. Motion's music is produced by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you to Sarah Pollock for designing Motion's graphics.